Dr. Gosha Lipinska. She completed her postgraduate studies in neuropsychology here at UCT and currently heads up the psychology department's sleep sciences branch. Her main research focus is centered on understanding the cognitive and emotional impact of chronic sleep deprivation in the context of psychiatric disorders. So I hope you enjoy this course on sleep and dreaming with Gosha. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and hello everybody. I apologize if I start to sit down for a little bit during my presentation. I've had some very bad flu this weekend and I'm still recovering, so bear with me a little. Who remembers what they dreamt about last night? Yeah? Who never remembers their dreams? So it's quite typical for people actually to fall on one or other side of the spectrum. Some people remember their dreams very frequently and others not so much. So as we get into this course, we're going to be chatting a little bit about what dreaming is for. But I'm going to start off with an introduction really about sleep, just to give you some context, the context in which we understand dreaming. So firstly, to think about sleep, we really have to think about consciousness, because sleep is an everyday state of unconsciousness. And if we think about consciousness, it's actually not a very easy question to answer. Sort of, what is consciousness? Does anyone have some thoughts about that? Awareness, yeah? Awareness, do you mean awareness as in being awake, or do you mean awareness of self? And at the back? Some degree of responding to the environment. Exactly. So I guess consciousness can be understood or explained sort of as a continuum from the experience essentially of feeling, of having experiences, versus to higher order consciousness where we may think of ourselves as self-aware, aware of our own consciousness. And so it depends where we draw that line. And that also has implications for how we understand the rest of the animal kingdom. So if we think about animals, are animals conscious? Anyone who's had a pet will certainly attest to the fact that they think that their animals are conscious. They're having experiences. They're having feelings. We can see that. And we'll see that later in the context of dreaming as well. So when we think about consciousness, we have altered states of consciousness, sort of differences or changes to our everyday experience of having feelings, experiences of being awake and of being self-aware. And these can be induced through things such as drugs or medication, hypnosis, for example, but also common everyday states such as daydreaming can be understood as altered states of consciousness. And sleep is certainly one state where there is an altered state of consciousness. We're learning more and more about sort of how sleep works, because it's a state of not being conscious, but there are certain biological mechanisms in place that help you to sort of track your environment a little bit. Who's had the experience, very common experience, it happens to me very often actually, where you know you have a very important appointment and you've set your alarm, but you wake up regularly before the onset of that alarm, right? So something's got to be going on to keep track of time there. And actually there's a very recent article that came out which showed that while we are asleep and unconscious, so we're blocking out external stimuli, there are parts of our brain that are keeping track of what's going on. Now sleep is quite bizarre because we think of a state of unconsciousness, for example, as coma or something like that. But actually, this is a state of unconsciousness that happens every 24 hours. And so, I mean, that's quite phenomenal. And it's also a state in which we are hallucinating, typically. And that is what we call dreams. So it's quite a weird state. It can be defined both physiologically and behaviorally. When we think about unconsciousness, sleep is reversible. I mean, thank goodness. So we go to sleep and then we wake up. It's defined by specific brain patterns, which I'm going to demonstrate and show to you just now. Eye movements, there's a decrease in muscle tone, and there's also a compensation if you stay awake. So if you stay awake for a very long time, there's increased pressure to go to sleep. So you feel more and more sleepy, less and less able to cope with the day, and that feeling of I have to go to sleep rises, and that is absolutely universal. Behaviorally, so what we can observe by both human and animal behavior, you are non-responsive to external stimuli. So even if somebody calls your name, of course some people are lighter or deeper sleepers, but for the most part you are not responsive to the environment as you are when you are awake. We adopt a typical position, so for humans that's lying down, and usually we find a safe place to do it. And there's at least one cycle per 24 hours. So if you think about it in some greater detail, it's actually a state in which we're very vulnerable because we're not aware of our environment for a good portion of time, yet it must be for something then if we are so vulnerable, but we do it every single 24-hour cycle. It's also found sort of to lend our thoughts towards why sleep is important. It's also found across all mammals, both fish, dolphins, reptiles, birds, and even worms and things like that have resting states when they are not active, which we can't define in the same way as we do in mammals as sleep, but certainly there's evidence of a quiet time. So it must be useful for something. And that is one of the great debates. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of broadly what sleep is useful for before we get to dreaming, which is a kind of a specific kind of consciousness that we experience during sleep. By the way, at any point, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. You don't have to keep them till the end at all. Oh, by the way, I wanted to say, does anyone know how dolphins sleep? Yeah, exactly. So because they have to breathe, they can't engage in sleep. They have to come up. So in other words, they have to perform fairly complicated motor activity to get to the surface of the water. They can't sleep with their entire brain because that would preclude being able to move. So they sleep with one hemisphere at a time. So that they're also not responsive to the environment in the same way. They swim in circles in a sort of stereotypical type way. So even in animals where, there's such a huge biological pressure to, in a way, remain awake because you have to come up to the surface to breathe, in these animals we still see evidence of sleep, just as we do in humans. It's marked by deep sleep, lighter sleep, Rem sleep. The sleep cycle, which I will tell you about in slightly greater detail, is biologically controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is found sort of more or less in the center of the brain. I don't think you can see my cursor moving there, but in the right-hand picture there, right in the center, sort of lower part of the brain. And in humans, we are entrained to the light cycle. So light really is the timekeeper that helps to tell our bodies when to go to sleep. And as I have an 18-month-old, and I know very well that one of the biggest challenges as a parent is to get your child to really respond to the cues in the environment and to the light cycle so that we can develop this good sort of habit of sleeping. So light is the thing that activates the center in the brain, which then activates a cascade of hormonal action through the pineal gland, which then releases, for example, melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone which tells us that we are sleepy. It doesn't actually make us go to sleep. It's simply the hormone of sleepiness. Many of you might have had difficulty sleeping at one time or another, and you may have been prescribed melatonin, in fact. It's a very useful, sort of more natural, quote-unquote, drug to take for sleep difficulties. Yeah. I think it is a little earlier than that, but it is true that they don't produce melatonin at the beginning. I can't quite remember the exact age, but yes, that's one of the things that needs to develop, and that's part of the sort of training that you get your child to respond to light. One of the big things for, if you don't have any difficulty sleeping, it doesn't really matter. But if you do have difficulty sleeping, how you go to sleep and what you do really, really matters. So, for example, this sort of modern phenomena of a lot of light exposure before we go to bed, either through cell phones, and I'm sure you would have heard about it in popular culture, through cell phones, through tablets, computers, media, is really, really terrible for our sleep cycles. And particularly the blue light, because the blue light is the thing which tells us in the morning to wake up. It's that dawn light which sort of signals to our brain, wake up, wake up, wake up. So if all you're doing at night is giving yourself a good dose of blue light, it's very reasonable to expect that falling asleep is difficult. Some people don't have any difficulty sleeping, doesn't really matter, but if you do experience difficulties, those are the kinds of changes you can make that really might make a difference. So taking melatonin is a very helpful way to help you feel sleepy, which for many, many people is just enough to bump you over into sleep. And so it doesn't actually cause you to go to sleep. It's not like the positive about it is that it's not like a sleeping tablet, which will actually sort of force the sleep cycle onto your body with certain consequences. You don't necessarily get as good quality sleep with hypnotics as you do, for example, with melatonin or with other natural behavioral ways of going to sleep. They bump off some of the sleep stages that are necessary, which I'll describe to you just now. So melatonin is quite a nice option for if you're having sleep difficulties, particularly just to get you sleepy. It has to be taken very precisely, though, each day for it to have an effect. And these are the recommendations, the recent recommendations provided to help guide us as to how much sleep is necessary. So I hope you can sort of see it. It's a little bit small. But over here we have older adults, young adults, and teenagers. And essentially, as we get older, our sleep need to some extent shortens. But certainly we still recommend for older adults 7 to 8 hours of sleep, and 7 to 9 for adults and young adults. Teenagers need more sleep, and as you get younger and younger, you need more and more sleep. Babies spend 14 to 17 hours asleep, and at the beginning, predominantly in Rem sleep, actually. There are, however, individuals who are genetically short sleepers. So I've had a couple of questions. People come up to you sometimes at dinner parties and tell you all about their sleep difficulties. And one of the common ones I've often had is, I only sleep 5 hours a night. I feel worried about this. Is this something to worry about? And the answer to that question is, does it have side effects on your life? So in other words, are you tired? Are you irritable? Are you forgetting things? Some people, and remember this is a very small percentage of the population, it follows the bell curve, are naturally genetically short sleepers. For example, Winston Churchill was probably one of those individuals who naturally had a 4 to 6 hour sleep cycle, which is a genetic phenomenon. You can actually test your genome for it. We know which genes are responsible for that. And sometimes researchers will run experiments where they literally divide people into groups based on whether they're short sleepers, long sleepers, whether they can deal with sleep deprivation or not. But again, remember that is, it's very rare in the population to be a short sleeper. Equally, it's very rare in the population to be a very long sleeper. Some people naturally need more sleep, more than 12 hours. But that's also very rare. Mostly, if you're getting less than 6 hours of sleep. In fact, there was a recent study that also came out that showed that your life expectancy is shortened considerably if you sleep less than 6 hours a night. And this is, remember, these are averages. So again, bearing in mind your natural predisposition to feel rested, well rested in the morning is the best guide for how much sleep you need. And we know that not getting enough sleep is a risk factor for pretty much everything, from psychiatric disorders to cardiometabolic disorders to dementias as well. So we have in our society forgotten that it's very important, but it is a very important part of our well-being. So how do we think about sleep from a neuroscientific point of view? So I'm going to describe what we pretty much do in the lab if we run a research study, what sort of stages we look at, how we define them, all of that. I'm also going to try keep track of the time because I can get a bit carried away, but I think we're right on track. So sleep is made of 4 electrophysiological stages, essentially, well, 5 really. By electrophysiological stages, I mean that we put electrodes on people's heads and we measure the small electrical activity that is a byproduct of neurons firing in your brain. So if you have a neuron firing, one that is perpendicular to the skull, we will pick it up with the small electrode that we glue onto the head. And we glue a whole lot of them in the night so that we can look at different areas of the brain. It's very crude in terms of location. It's very bad at telling us where the signal comes from, but it's very good in time. We know exactly when something is happening. So we have these 4 stages, first 4 stages of what we call non-REM sleep or non-rapid eye movement sleep. That's essentially going from light sleep to deep sleep. It's what happens when you initially fall asleep. Stage 1 is sort of almost not really a stage of sleep. If you come into the room while somebody is in stage 1 sleep, so in other words, you can see on your computer monitor you've identified stage 1 sleep, they'll often tell you that they're thinking about this and this. It's that sort of fuzzy period of falling asleep. Stage 2, you are properly asleep and we see specific electrophysiological markers. And then stage 3 and 4 is what we term deep sleep. If you are woken up out of deep sleep, that's when you feel so very groggy and you often feel disoriented and you don't know what's happening. That's essentially deep sleep, and it's very important for regulating many physiological processes. And then after those 4 stages, we usually pop up into REM sleep. So if we're following this graph over here, you can see that from the left we're starting through wake. We go in stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's our deep sleep. You'll see it marked in green as slow wave sleep there at the bottom, in other words, deep sleep. And then as we come out of that deep sleep, we typically pop into REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. And that's the sleep that we most closely associate with dreaming. As you'll see, the 2 halves of the night are quite different. So in the first half of the night, we spend most of our time in slow wave sleep with these tiny little bursts of REM sleep on the top, capping there in sort of that gray color. And as we progress into the second half of the night, we experience almost no slow wave sleep in the second half, while we experience quite a lot of REM sleep. So most of the dreams that you'll remember when you wake up will be from the second half of the night. Every human goes through about 4 or 5 of those cycles a night, starting stage 1, popping up to REM sleep, and then back down again. Of course, with that sort of profile through the night, going from slow wave sleep dominated first half, REM sleep dominated second half. So this is just an idea to give you, to show you what it looks like on the EEG, so the electroencephalogram. That's the thing that's recording all this electrical activity that's coming off the top of your head. So wake is essentially shown on the top there, which is like sort of quite a thick squiggle. It's a very small waveform, but very high frequency. So in other words, there's a lot of waves in a short space of time. And the reason for this is because you have a hell of a lot of neurons firing at the same time. And so they're all cancelling each other out. And this means that you have this very high frequency with this low amplitude. It's very short. And as we go into sleep, we sort of see this graph relax a little bit. So by the time, remember, stage 1 is sort of like this fuzzy in between. Stage 2, we start to see these things. If you look at stage 2, which is the third line, you'll start to see these like pointy things popping out. And those are called K complexes, and that's how we know that the person is in stage 2. And then deep sleep is where the graph sort of really relaxes, and you see these really big waves float across the screen. And the reason for that is actually because most of the brain is quiet at that time, but it has these sudden bursts. And because it's quiet, the burst comes up and it's synchronized as this big burst, and then it stops firing, and so it drops. And that's why you have this pattern of very big waves. And this is what REM sleep looks like. REM is characterized by, rapid eye movement sleep, characterized by eye movements, which look like the first 2 lines, sort of these like jaggedy movements as your eyes flick backwards and forwards. It's also characterized by a loss of muscle tone. So your muscle tone goes flat. Does anyone know why that happens? Yeah, exactly. So because REM sleep, it's so common for us to dream in REM sleep, we might, because when you're dreaming, you really believe that you're having those experiences. And so it would be natural for you to have muscle activity with that, for you to be acting it out. And in fact, there's a disorder called REM sleep behavior disorder. It's often a precursor to Parkinson's, which is exactly the failure of that mechanism to prevent us from having high muscle activity during this stage of sleep. So there's a brainstem mechanism at the back of our head which controls essentially movement going down into the body, and that is blocked and you're not able to move. So at the beginning of the night, it might be actually like a minute, 2 minutes. Towards the end, you're having 20, 25-minute cycles of REM sleep. So you can have fairly elaborate, complicated dream in that time. Yes, absolutely. So according to this picture over here, it's, in that second half of the night, you're having those cycles of REM sleep. Yeah, that come sort of successively, and then you pop out into sort of stage 1 and stage 2 sleep. Yes? So that's a very good question. Sleepwalking, actually, you think it's sort of something that happens maybe associated with dreaming or something like that, but it's not at all. It happens in this green part of sleep, slow wave sleep, and it's basically the activation of your muscle centers. Like pathologically, it's not supposed to happen, but it does happen because our biology is not perfect. The activation of sort of these stereotyped kind of motor plans, and one is for walking. So actually, that's the most common one, and so those walking centers are essentially activated, and you go for a walk. But you're fully asleep. In children, children might have. It's most common in children. Some adults have them as well. But you have night terrors, which are if the child looks absolutely and utterly terrified. But if you wake them up, they can't actually recall any dreammentation, for example. And that's also, it's like a disinhibition of emotion and fear coming from slow wave sleep or coming from deep sleep. It's characterized usually by happening in the first half of the night when we know people are in deep sleep, and it's characterized by no dreammentation. So it's different from a nightmare, which happens typically out of Rem sleep, which is associated with dream content. Yeah.
What then causes bedwetting?
So we don't fully understand that, but it's a as we become adults, we know how to hold our bowel and bladder movements. So it's a disinhibition of that. We know it's often it can be associated with emotional trauma. Not always, though. Some kids just really struggle at night. From the parents I've spoken to, their sort of experiences, well, my child's just so fast, so deeply asleep. That's, that kind of mechanism seems to fail. Because the natural state of being is not to have any muscle control. We learn muscle control. And sleep is a relaxation of most sort of muscle activity. But we learn to be able to maintain that, as most animals are, through sleep. So it's some kind of a failure of that mechanism as well. But exactly how that works, under what conditions and how it's tied to, for example, emotion, we don't really understand those mechanisms yet. Yes, absolutely. So, you can have, during sleep, you have like restless leg syndrome can translate into periodic leg movements, which is essentially leg movement. Like everybody twitches and moves in their sleep, that's quite common. But when it's actually waking you up all the time, that's essentially the translation of restless leg syndrome into sleep, which can be treated. Some people really struggle with it. It can be really quite debilitating, but can be treated pharmacologically as well. Okay, so that sort of essentially lays the groundwork for how we understand sleep from a neuroscientific point of view, at least electrophysiologically. And it's helpful because when we start to talk about dreaming, we can really understand which stages are associated with dreaming, what are the things that can go wrong, those kinds of things. But when we started off, we were saying, well, what is sleep for, really? It seems we spend one hell of a lot of time. We spend a third of our lives asleep, at least if you just sort of take the adult average. So it's really got to be important for something. Some people have proposed that it's important to conserve calories, actually. So if you awake the whole time, you would simply burn too many calories, and it would be very difficult to replenish them from the environment. Maybe not so much for humans, but when we had to forage and look after ourselves, that was the case. But the difference between staying awake but still and asleep is about the equivalent of a hot dog roll. So that can't be a very good reason, at least that energy saving. So other researchers have proposed that it's really important for brain function, that we have essentially one sort of apparatus, the brain, which has to have experiences, conscious experiences, and then has to make sense of them. And so we need a time where we are able to not have stimuli, and so that we can make sort of sense of those experiences. And there seems to be pretty good evidence for that. And that's what I'm going to explain to you a little bit now about some of the memory and emotional functions that sleep might have. Other researchers have argued that sleep's really important for restoring your body. And there seems to be pretty good evidence for that as well. Quite recently, it was a couple of years ago, there was a really important study that came out which showed that the toxins in your brain are specifically only cleared during periods of sleep. And it was described really beautifully and biologically, where the toxins leak out into the cerebrospinal fluid from brain cells, specifically during slow wave sleep. And we know that, for example, dementia such as Alzheimer's disease are the build-up of tangles and toxins in the brain. And we know that individuals who are sleeping, like through their lives, sleep a lot less, are more likely to develop dementias than individuals who sleep well. So there seems to be a really sort of important relationship there. Getting enough sleep allows for those toxins to be removed, which essentially keeps your brain healthy. So there is good evidence for the theory which says that sleep is important for recovery and restoration. But I'm going to focus a little bit in the next couple of slides on brain function. Sleep is important for maintaining brain function along the lines of we have this one brain and it needs to have experiences, plus it needs to make sense of these experiences. So in the last maybe 15 years by now, there's been an explosion of research showing that sleep is so very important for memory consolidation. And you'll know if you've ever had a period in your life where you were not sleeping well, for example, if you were a new parent, that you forget pretty much anything that may happen in your day. My husband, when our baby was quite small, he'd often say to me, "I told you this thing," and I have no memory of it whatsoever. And that's quite a common experience. And we know that healthy sleep is really important for memory function. And the cool thing is now that we have actually a very good biological description of how that happens. It seems to be tied both to these stages of sleep called deep sleep or slow wave sleep in green, and Rem sleep, which is sort of in this red color. They both seem to have important memory functions. So slow wave sleep in particular, and there's an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. It's really where you encode your memories, and then they are sort of distributed into other parts of the brain. But it seems that sleep is very, very important for that distribution function. So things that are encoded during the day in the hippocampus, so experiences that you may have or facts that you may have learnt that have been stored in the hippocampus are then literally distributed into other parts of the brain. So just to click quickly to the next slide, the way that that happens is that if you have a memory trace, there's a process by which you have these literally these bursts of firing in the hippocampus, which are sort of forced to synchronize with bursts of firing from the neocortex, particularly the frontal lobe, so the outside layer of the brain. And this sort of coordination and firing, they fire at exactly the same time, and they've shown this really well in rats, for example, leads to the transfer of these memory traces from the brain center responsible for memory to other parts of the brain. And this is really important so that, for example, the next day, you're able to take on more information. Your hippocampus is really quite a tiny part of the brain, so it can't store everything. In fact, most memories are stored in other parts of the brain. So this is one mechanism which explains how these memories are actually moved to other parts of the brain. And so that this, for example, here we have the hippocampus. This is slow wave sleep. Sorry, you guys can't see my cursor. On the left there, you have, at the bottom, you have the hippocampus, and you've got a memory trace in that deep orange, those dots. And through slow wave sleep, it literally gets integrated into other networks of knowledge in neocortical, in other words, in the outside layers of the brain. So that means that essentially information, you can make sense of things that you've learned in context of the other things that you know about the world, which is a very useful thing. Also, something that happens during slow wave sleep, which is equally very important, is that we get rid of information that's not important. If we take ourselves back, let's say, to 2018, to February the 12th, if you guys think about that day, can you, unless it was something very significant, in which case you can ignore this, but can you remember what you had for breakfast that day or what you wore that day? And do you think if you went to a lot of psychological therapy, you'd be able to bring back that memory? Probably not. So in other words, things that are not important are eliminated from the brain. We have one brain and we really have to prioritize what we remember or what we don't remember. And so it seems that sleep is really important for getting rid of these connections that are not so important. Essentially, one of the ways that that happens is that emotion often tags something as very important, which then means that it gets consolidated, in other words, strengthened. But those things that don't have enough sort of tagging, as it were, there's just massive downscaling of all connections. And those connections that are not strong enough simply won't survive that downscaling. And that is essentially the elimination of unimportant information from the brain.
Also, maybe if you had a very bad experience, usually after you've had something devastating, but tomorrow morning if you had good sleep, it seems not so bad. So naturally you discard it.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's a very important sleep function that happens, and that's to do with emotional regulation. But it seems that the mechanism of that is a little bit different, and that might have to do with REM sleep and how we sort of process emotional information. I'm going to describe that in a little while. And that's also something that links to psychiatric disorders, because some people have very bad experiences that they can't forget about. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder, and disordered sleep seems to be a part of that as well. So we're going to chat about that. And that's also something that slow wave sleep does, is that it gets rid of all these unimportant connections. REM sleep is also important for memory consolidation. So while slow wave sleep seems to move information so that it can be integrated and get rid of stuff that's really not that important, this doesn't mean once it's been moved that it's going to last for any amount of time. And what researchers have shown is that REM sleep is important for activating certain genes, which actually make those synapses quite strong. So you don't have this dialogue between different parts of the brain. On the right-hand side, you'll see there's a little cross between the hippocampus and the rest of the brain. There's not this dialogue happening. But what is happening is that those sort of deep purple dots in the top right-hand square are being made solid. So in other words, the gene expression that's happening is making those connections last. So it's not only the fact that information is moved, because I mean that's great, but that doesn't mean it's going to last a long time. That happens in deep sleep, but also that it's being strengthened in REM sleep. So both these stages seem to be important. And if we think about the cycle of sleep, where we are going from sort of the first half dominated by deep sleep and the second half dominated by REM sleep, it makes sense that there's this progression. Essentially, in the first half, you are sort of making sense of the information. You're consolidating it, you're getting rid of connections that are not important, and then in the second half, you're really strengthening those connections. So that all sort of makes sense quite nicely. Of course, this is sort of like a summary of the information that's out there. This field isn't nearly as united as I'm presenting it today. There's a lot of discrepancies and people don't agree on a lot of things, but at least this is sort of like the main themes that seem to be popping out. And so here in this picture, I've described to you already the synchronized firing that happens between parts of the brain in slow wave sleep. But in REM sleep, we have the activation of these genes, which act on actual individual synapses, which then make them last a long time. So that's great. So we know something about memory. But we also know, as you very well pointed out, that sleep seems to regulate our emotions. We all know that if we've been sleep deprived for a while, we are ratty, moody, unpleasant, awful human beings to be around. And that's quite common. And so it seems that sleep has this really important function of regulating our mood. And we're starting to be able to describe that neuroscientifically. And there's different ways that sort of researchers have looked at this. Some people have looked at following the sort of memory paradigm, looking at emotional material, or the sort of how emotional memory is processed. Some have looked at fear conditioning or extinction. So if you'll remember Pavlov's dogs, where you have a bell that, for example, goes off and the food is presented to the dog. After some time, you ring the bell and the dog will salivate, in other words, have the response to the food that will arrive without the food actually being there. And that's conditioning. Some random thing is paired with something that has meaning, which then evokes a certain physiological response. And conditioning happens to all of us in very many ways. So sleep seems to be important for regulating fear conditioning, and also for regulating our mood and our emotion. So that's that kind of feeling of, you maybe had a really hard day, maybe something traumatic or difficult happened, you sleep on it, and over time you feel quite a lot better. So looking at emotional memory first off. So we know that sleep seems to consolidate our emotional memory. So in other words, memory for things that really matter to us, essentially, for things that are positive or negative, a lot more than neutral information. And this seems to be related somehow to REM sleep. We know that if you look at your ability to remember emotional information, it correlates with the amount of REM sleep that you had. We also know that if you're sleep deprived, you tend to have a bias for negatively valenced information. And that also sort of may make us think, for example, to psychiatric disorders like depression, where individuals have a lot of difficulty sleeping, but they also tend to focus or ruminate on things that are more negative in the environment. So it seems that sleep's really important for us being able to hang on to sort of a balanced amount of information. And in fact, in a study in our laboratory with individuals that had PTSD and healthy individuals, when individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder slept normally, they were able to, as healthy individuals, were able to remember balanced amount of both positive and negative information and neutral information over the night. So in other words, these things are potentially reversible as well in these conditions, provided that you do get a good night's sleep. As I mentioned before, sleep also seems to be important for this conditioning effect. So just to refresh, conditioning happens when something that is absolutely meaningless, so in the case of Pavlov's dogs, you have the bell that goes off that's paired with the significant stimulus, so that's the food, the thing that's very attractive, and that makes the dog salivate. And so you pair those two for a bunch of time, and then after some time you remove the thing that's so like emotionally valuable, in other words, the food, and the dog will still salivate in the absence of the food. So in other words, there's been conditioning that's occurred. The bell, which is like an arbitrary thing, it could be a color or something like that, then brings on the physiological response. Now, sleep seems to be very important for something, or a concept that's related to conditioning, which is called extinction. So let's just say you're in a bad car accident, and every time you now see an Opel Astra, you suddenly jump and you have a sort of fear response. So Opel Astras, there's millions of them. They're not necessarily, they're not dangerous in of themselves. The Opel Astra has been, the image of the Opel Astra has been the conditioned stimulus which evokes a physiological response. But now it might be the case that not only does the Opel Astra evoke fear, but actually a lot of other cars, perhaps ones that are similar in shape or form or color, also evoke that strong startle response in you after you've had that very bad car accident. That's what we call generalization. So it's not only that specific thing, but another related thing also evokes this fear response. Now, it seems that sleep is very important for dampening down that fear response, and particularly for the generalization of one thing to another. So Over time, say with the car, if you're sort of a healthy individual, over time you see opal astras, they're not in car accidents, you learn to trust again that when you see an opal astra, you don't have the startle response. That's what we call extinction. It's the dampening down, because in other words, the thing that evokes the fear is never again paired with the very bad thing that happened. So over time you have extinction. Now, sleep seems to be very important for the generalization of that extinction. We want to be able to extinguish things. When bad things happen, we need to come down back to normal sort of physiological rest. But it's not only for opal astras. When we see other cars, we also need to calm down. And so, say, cars that were related to the opal astra make us so fearful, sleep will help us generalize that extinction, not only from opal astras, but to other cars, and for opal astras as well. So, in other words, it's very important for regulating this kind of conditioned effect. And it also seems to be regulated by REM sleep. So please do feel free to ask any questions as well. Some of the concepts. And hallucinogenic substances. So I think the question is, there's information or there's research coming out of Johns Hopkins University which is showing that, for example, hallucinogenics are useful in treating PTSD, if I understand the question correctly. And is there any association, for example, between REM processes, because they seem to be so important for dampening down these physiological responses that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and the action of these hallucinogenic drugs? I'm really not sure, actually. I mean, in very broad brush strokes, but I don't know about the specific mechanisms. So hallucinogenics will activate limbic systems of the brain, so in other words, emotional centers, as will REM sleep, which I'm also about to tell you about now. But that's very crude. You know, it's like kind of activity in the same brain area. That's about, but the actual mechanism, sort of specifics around what happens, which areas of the limbic system and how they're activated, I'm not sure. But that's a really interesting question.
When doctors deliberately put somebody who's been seriously injured into a coma and then maintain that, how does that link to this?
Well, essentially that's a state of unconsciousness, I suppose, so that the body can repair. My sort of hypothesis around that would be that one of the functions of sleep and a general state of unconsciousness is for reparation, and so the body is better able to repair itself. It's also not doing work while having experiences, so there's less stuff to essentially, I mean, your body, when it's had a very traumatic experience, has to really focus on the reparation rather than kind of carry on with everyday activities. So that state of being unconscious then allows for that, or has a better chance of doing the reparation work that needs to be done than while you continue to have experiences, both mental experiences and physical ones. Yeah.
Following on from that, does coma sleep replicate normal sleep in terms of slow wave and REM sleep?
No, not the pattern that we have, no. It is characterized by slow waves. So you will have that pattern of sort of like bursts of firing, for example, that we see in slow wave sleep, but it won't, for example, you won't change stages like you do in normal sleep.
So you have no REM sleep?
No, there's no REM sleep in coma. Yeah.
All this is your things about sleep and state and so on. Does it also apply when a person takes a sleeping pill? Or is the sleep a different nature?
That's a very good question. So the typical benzodiazepines that are prescribed as sleeping pills flatten both your REM sleep and your slow wave sleep. So in other words, you're missing two of the key components that are so important for all these brain processes. So those are really, they're good as symptomatic relief. In other words, sometimes you just really need to get a good night's sleep, and getting that good night's sleep is preferable than having, a healthy sleep pattern. You really need it. But as a long-term solution, it's not a great solution because you're constantly depriving yourself of those really important sleep stages. There are newer drugs called the Z-class drugs, zolpidem, and there's a whole range of them, which have a much better sleep profile. But again, they're not perfect, both in mimicking the sleep cycle, but also in the fact that they're quite addictive drugs. So I would definitely favor more behavioral interventions when it comes to difficulties with sleep, rather than and using those kinds of drugs as symptomatic relief. Like, say you have a really important thing the next day, that's a good time to take a sleeping pill. Yeah.
When you talk about the amount of sleep you need, even 6 to 8 hours, is it the same if you wake for 4 hours? Then you cheat, in other words.
You mean if you have 2 periods of 4 hours of sleep?
It's the same value.
So there's quite a lot of sort of cultural, historic kind of debate that's going along the lines of it doesn't all have to be in one stretch. And in fact, we know different cultures sleep differently. The phenomenon of sleeping all in one go is actually quite a recent Western phenomenon. There's quite a lot of evidence to show that in medieval times and going further back, individuals used to go to sleep usually about 2 to 3 hours or 1 to 3 hours after dark onset. They used to sleep for a while, then get up and do a whole bunch of things, and then go back to sleep until dawn. And that's, you don't have to have it all in one go. That seems to work just fine. And so for those of you who do wake up at like 3 or 4 in the morning, but then are able to get back to sleep, it's fine. It's just that our modern lives often don't support that kind of lifestyle. It's more difficult. You can't always wake up at 8. It would be nice.
You mentioned Churchill. He used to sleep every afternoon and then wake up and then work until about 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Seemed to survive very well.
Yeah, he's also probably a genetic short sleeper. So don't necessarily take that as a sort of recipe for your own life, necessarily.
What about cat nap?
So,
Some people find cat napping very good and very refreshing.
yeah, so I mean, that's absolutely fine. It depends whether it interferes with your nighttime sleep. If you nap and then you can't sleep at night, don't nap in the day. That's kind of if it prevents you from sleeping, having a short nap, they sort of recommend 20 minutes, but it's different for everybody. I find often if I'm very tired and I have an hour's sleep, it takes me a little while to get going. Once I get going, I'm firing on all cylinders. So it does seem to depend, yeah. Well, I mean, definitely. I mean, there's sort of 2 questions, but yes, when you are having the experience of remembering something, those brain centers which are responsible, for audio, sound, for example, are certainly firing. And we know that sleep consolidates. So like when you're talking about distribution, that information will then be distributed, say, to memory traces that are associated with sound generation. And so that's why it's also so important, that slow wave sleep stage, to kind of integrate that information. No, so usually like parts of the memory are parts of one event are sort of stored in totally different areas of the brain. And then when you are remembering it, there's a coordination between those centers of the brain. How that